Hey, welcome back. Today, we're talking about the intersection of science, spirituality, and entrepreneurship with Dr. Anna Yusim, a renowned psychiatrist, author, and spiritual teacher. Now, Anna's journey is not a conventional one. She began on a traditional path through Stanford, Yale Medical School, and a highly successful psychiatric career, but then something shifted. Unexplainable synchronicities with her patients and a dream about Kabbalah steered her toward a much deeper inquiry into the mind, soul, and interconnectedness of all things. Why does this conversation matter? Because entrepreneurship is hard. It's about the inner journey that we're all on, navigating fear and uncertainty and those moments when we feel stuck or disconnected. Anna brings a fresh perspective to these challenges, and together we explore how to tap into intuition, embrace spirituality, and address our own inner blocks and the things that are holding us back from thriving both in business and in life. In this episode, you'll also hear us tackle big questions that matter to entrepreneurs. How do we grow through pain and trauma? How can we use creativity and purpose to overcome burnout? And perhaps most importantly, how can we stay connected to ourselves and others in the chaos of building a business? So if you've ever felt like there's more to entrepreneurship than just the grind, or you're searching for tools to break free from old patterns and create something truly meaningful, then this is the episode for you. Let's get started with Dr. Anna Yusim. So great. Hey, Anna, thanks so much for joining us. It's great to see you today.
It's a pleasure to be here with you today, Alex. Thank you for having me.
Now, you have when I was preparing for this episode and I was reading more about your work, I see a lot of things that I would say are like traditional in the sense of an impressive medical and psychiatric career. You went to Stanford, you went to Yale Medical School, you're on your way, you're building this successful career, and to a lot of people, you would think, well, this is kind of normal. This is a path that one takes. And then I realized that you then take a big turn into all sorts of much less traditional areas, things like spirituality and soul. And you wrote this incredible book, Fulfilled. And so you've done all sorts of stuff that is in a totally different vein than I think a lot of people would believe a normal, no quote unquote normal psychiatry path or medical path would be. And that really sparked some curiosity in me. And it got me thinking, is this something where the fire was always alive in you to do that? Or how is it that we got here? How is it that we got from that path into what is now a much broader and, dare I say, more interesting or more alive area of work for you?
Absolutely, Alex. Had anyone told me 25 years ago that I would become a spiritual person, I would have laughed. Spirituality was the furthest thing from my mind. But then as I was completing my residency training, interesting things start to happen in my life and in my connections with patients that made me think, what's going on here? Maybe the world and our minds work a little bit differently than I was taught in medical school. And that set me down this trail of inquiry. And what I mean by that is I started to have experiences with patients where, for instance, a patient would have a dream about something that happened in my life and then come and tell me. And this patient had no way of knowing that this happened, and yet their dream was completely accurate. And I would have experiences where something would slip out of my mouth and I would say something that I didn't mean to say that was incredibly meaningful to the patient because somehow I had tapped into something unknowingly that was very important in this therapeutic encounter. And it was outside of my and the patient's consciousness in a way. So these little synchronicities started to happen. And then it led me to think, we're taught that our minds are separate and distinct. But here's experiences where we're actually more interconnected with one another than we thought. And it was things like this that led me down this path of, I wonder how the mind works. And I wonder what else there is other than the neurobiological pathways and the psychiatric mechanisms that I was taught in medical school.
So you went down a completely different route and said, I want to go all in on this. And there's not a lot of places to go study these types of spiritual connections and so on. So you really had to create your own curriculum, right?
Absolutely. And, as they say, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And so my first teacher was actually Kabbalah. It was the Kabbalah Center. I had a dream one day of a sign that said Kabbalah Revealed on it. And I was like, what is this? And I remember my mom had told me about Kabbalah, and I thought maybe she sent me a book a while ago. So I went to check my bookshelf, but there wasn't any book called Kabbalah Revealed. And a few weeks later, I was walking to dinner with a friend, and I saw that exact sign from my dream. It said Kabbalah Revealed. And so I was like, what is this? So I walked in. It was the Kabbalah Center in New York. So I took a class, and that was my first foray into the spiritual world. And that started to give me language and an understanding of another way to think of the world other than what I'd been taught in medical school.
Wow, that's super interesting, and I can't wait to hear more as we go through some of these topics related to how this might apply to folks who are building businesses. So, one of the themes at Conscious Entrepreneur is how do I access sort of inner tools that are going to help me as I go through building a business. Now, as you know, a lot of entrepreneurs are stuck in their heads, right? Very logical, ROI driven, out there sort of trying to prove a business case or disrupt a market or what have you, but always living in our heads. How can entrepreneurs start to think about tapping into, like what you just mentioned, intuition or interconnectedness or other things that are out there? How can they start to open themselves up to these kind of opportunities?
Yeah. So it's an interesting question, Alex, because then the deeper question is what leads people to change? What leads people to seek out growth experiences? The number one thing is actually pain, right? Being in pain in some way, shape, or form, whether that is a divorce, a breakup, your company not doing as well, bankruptcy, something, an illness, whatever that is often what opens people to start seeing the world a little bit differently. And then they start to search, and then they start to grow. And often our greatest pain ends up being our greatest teacher. Now, there's two ways that we can grow: proactively and reactively. Reactive growth is in response to pain. Proactive growth is the other kind of growth that you're genuinely curious and you're like, I feel that there's more. Let me find out what there is, not based on any pain I have. And maybe if I can grow in this way, I can avoid so much of the pain than otherwise I would have to deal with reactively. So I think that those are the two ways. It's through genuine curiosity and then through a response to pain.
Wow, I've never heard it phrased that way, but when you say it, I think, I think a lot of entrepreneurs are motivated by some element of conscious or unconscious, subconscious pain, meaning there's some kind of change I want in my life, or I want to prove something. There's a lot of links to previous trauma, life trauma that they might have experienced, which causes them to think and act in a certain way. So there probably is a big motivation around pain.
Absolutely. And the trauma piece is also huge because everybody has some form of trauma, either trauma with a capital T, which is the big trauma where there was the threat to loss of life or limb, or the smaller T's, which are more, being offended in some way, shape, or form, or attachment issues that didn't go as well as they could have, or something that didn't put your life in jeopardy, but was still deeply, deeply painful, such as a breakup. And so those things often end up being our greatest teachers. And indeed, if we can take that and harness the power of that to then go beyond, then if we can see at those times, you know what, this is really paining me. So how can I use this now to be my best self? Thank goodness that this is in my life because this is motivating me in a way that nothing else ever can. So now I'm going to take this and be the best version of myself, grow, because I know that this is only temporary as well.
One of the things that's kind of confused me and that I've struggled with a little bit since we've been working on Conscious Entrepreneur is the world. There seems to be a really clear line between the people who get it. They understand that the work that basically entrepreneurship is a spiritual path, if you will, right? Or like that's their thing. And then everyone else who thinks this is total woo-woo. Why would I waste any time or energy doing this? I just want to focus on, the coal face of the business, type of idea. And when I hear you talk about this, one of the questions that comes up to me is like, how would you typically talk with someone who wasn't already on board with this, right? So someone who, maybe they've got something going on in their life. You've obviously, in your work, you've talked to lots of people who may not be quite as far along as you are or others. So what's the starting point for this conversation?
Absolutely. So, you can think of it as spirituality, like that's one way. But the other way is just really as a growth process. And my work in general is meeting people where they're at. And so if I'm with someone who wants to grow, but they have no interest in spirituality, beautiful. We're going to grow in that way. And we're going to see growth through that perspective. And if I'm with someone who has always dabbled in spirituality and wants to explore that even further and wants to use that as the focus of their growth, beautiful, we'll do that. But I would always meet the person where they're at. And with respect to growth, realize that we have two possibilities for a life path. The path of comfort and complacency, which is what most people choose, and then the path of growth and transformation. Usually the people who come to me, which are the entrepreneurs, C-suite executives, et cetera, Olympic athletes, those are the people who are really into growth and transformation. They want the growth. They want the tools to grow, and they're willing to do the work.
Yeah, but most of our gang is not going to be interested in the comfort and complacency part of life. We've actively chosen to forswear that, and so are moving on. And at the same time, like spirituality doesn't always land, or there's a lot of conversation about it. But the idea of growth, I think, is really, really interesting. And when I've come across this in my businesses, I'll say that every time I come up against what I believe to be an external obstacle to growth, like whatever, sales or marketing or some impediment to the business's growth, more often than not, it's something going on within me that needs to be addressed, right? So for me, it usually shows up as either I don't feel like I'm worthy of taking that next step, right? Like, but I'd have to put myself more out there, or I'd have to ask questions I'm not sure what the answers are going to be, or whatever it is. So that comes up a lot. And then the other one that comes up for me sometimes is like thinking big enough, right, versus thinking a little bit smaller. So the reason I'm sharing this is I think a lot of people assume that things like growth, business success, all the things that they think they want in the material world are all out there in 3D versus actually being things that they can work on. You can work on like right now inside yourself.
100%, Alex. I completely agree. And with people who are very, very committed to their business success, they're usually very committed to growth in that way and willing to do what it takes. However, their growth may actually be in another domain. Their growth might be in the domain of relationships. They might need to learn how to be more vulnerable, how to open themselves up, how to learn to trust and open their heart. It seems unrelated, but it's 100% related. It's like, how can you be a whole person who's able to have a whole and rich life? What is holding you back in any aspect of your life? Your work is a microcosm often of the rest of your life, but oftentimes what shows up in work often will also show up in the rest of your life and vice versa. Like I have these amazing CEOs who are incredible at work, and then we start to talk about their marriage, and it's, much more dicey. It's much more sensitive. There's a lot more work to do. It's much more tentative. So the work is there. They are amazingly good at doing everything within the work sphere and are willing to do it all. And I'll tell them exactly what they need to do and they'll do it. But it's within the interpersonal realm that the true challenge is going to lie.
Yeah. And as the saying goes, how you do one thing is how you do everything. And so it turns out that lo and behold, these same issues or friction points will appear in lots of different parts of your life, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so what are the things that you see people struggling with the most? So you mentioned, okay, people might be really good. If I'm a high performing athlete or a high performing entrepreneur CEO, I'm going to be really good at certain things, but I'm going to have my blind spots. I'm going to have the areas where things are shaky. What are the patterns that are out there?
Yeah, there's so many different patterns. I have Olympic athletes that I work with, and now, some of these people have really turned the corner, but the difficulty was relationships. And it was really about finding the kind of person with whom they could truly connect and open their heart. That was, one such thing. Then there was individuals who were actually quite good at relationships, but they weren't very balanced and they would keep burning themselves out over and over. And how would burnout show up in these individuals? They would get sick. They would get sick with all kinds of different conditions. So we had to figure out how to put them more in touch with their bodies so that they were able to actually say no, create better, boundaries and schedules for themselves and not get so sick and actually do so much more, both in their work life and their relationship life. There's also individuals who are really amazing in the public sphere, and like really just superstars, like the best of the best. And within more personal relationships, they're constantly bored, no matter who they're with. This is another pattern. And so they're constantly thrill seeking. So seeking things outside of a marriage or outside of a relationship, or, to constantly deal with this inner boredom, which ultimately stems from inner emptiness and from some deeper inner trauma. So that's another pattern. And those are just a few, because the number of patterns are as varied as are the number of people.
So inner emptiness, tell us more.
Yeah, this is on some level, this is individuals who have accomplished so much, done more than most people have in life, and yet somehow feel that there's something missing, that there's something that's a little bit of a numbness and a dullness within. They're a little bit bored by life. They feel like they're constantly not enough. And it comes from that. And there's all these different ways. And they then seek to compensate and overcompensate for that by continuing to accomplish more and more and more and more and more, or seeking, relationships outside of their marriage over and over and over again, that something finally is going to fill that inner void. But so there's a lot of ways to think of an inner void. One is that by virtue of being human, you will have an existential void. All of us as humans have that. And so the question is, how do you fill your void? And we can fill it in constructive ways, which is through purposeful, meaningful activity, through exercise, through joy, through love, through relationship. Or you can fill it in destructive ways, through drugs and alcohol, through all sorts of other addictions, through God knows what, right? But having that inner emptiness, it's a very human thing, but there are some people for whom that's like the crux of their issue. That's like at the root of everything.
And it's generally just part of the human condition, meaning we all have likely some flavor or variety of this same feeling. And then how do we start to deal with it? And some people deal with it by quitting their job and starting a company, or some people deal with it because they really like the struggle of entrepreneurship. Like I used to be like that. I used to just love the struggle of the whole thing, and just kind of feeling like, okay, at least I'm doing something. I'm moving, right? I'm moving forward. And so those can be ways that people can deal with it. But presumably there are more adult and healthier ways to start approaching this. Give us some examples.
Well, no, I mean, I think actually loving struggle, and because that's like a commitment to growth, right? Wanting to do something new, wanting to do something, because that's you're also tapping into your creativity, like creating something anew. That's a beautiful way to fill your inner void, to be creative. And creativity is creating a company, writing a book, creating a piece of art, creating a baby, being a mother. Beautiful ways to fill that inner void. And then there's some less constructive and more destructive ways, which usually are, in the realm of addiction, being addicted to whatever. And just to be clear, even though we often think of addiction having to do with drugs or alcohol, there's plenty of behavioral addictions, sex addiction, food addiction, exercise addiction, and there's psychological addictions to status, power, money, fame. And you can know when you have a psychological addiction when the more of it you have, the less successful you feel, or the worse you feel, the more empty you feel. So all of those things, money, power, status, achievement, wonderful things to have. However, when that becomes your end all be all and you start to feel more empty, the more of it you have, then you have this psychological addiction. So those are destructive ways of filling your inner void.
So then I'm just kind of like grasping at the same thing, but I don't feel good, even though I have more of it. I'm continuing to spiral down or be stuck in the same mental grooves that I was before.
Exactly. Yeah. You're trying to like fill it with something outside of you, and something that society usually deems to be really positive: money, status, power, fame, etc. And we know so many people who seem to have it all and yet commit suicide. That's like the perfect example of that. I mean, it's not to say that's the only reason. People have also mental illness, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. Like those are also the reasons, but this is part of it for sure.
So, Anna, let's talk here about mindset for a second. It said that we have something in the neighborhood of like 70,000 thoughts a day, right? So at least the way that I've heard it described, we have 70 some odd thousand thoughts a day, 90% of which were the exact same as the thoughts we had yesterday. So in terms of mindset, if I'm an entrepreneur, if I'm wanting to change my mindset about a certain thing, could be a habit or behavior. It could be a personality of mine. It could just be some sort of embedded idea that I have that I want to shake off. But I've got years and years and years, decades worth of thinking the same thoughts over and over again. That creates some pretty deep grooves in the brain. Some pretty efficient connections in terms of how fast a certain thought's going to appear into my head, right? What are your tools for shaking that up? What are your tools for going to someone and saying, look, we want to, change how you think about XYZ thing, whatever it is. And there's a lot that's already happened. How do we start to take a first step?
Absolutely. So it's a great question, Alex. And whenever I think about something like this, I think about it from a biopsychosocial spiritual framework, because all of those could underlie why we think the way we think, right? Biologically, depression is actually a disease of thinking. So we could be thinking thoughts that are inherently depressive because we are depressed. And the issue could actually be a biological issue. And what we need to change our thoughts is actually a medication. And then you get on a medication, you start to feel better. And so I'm not like pushing or super pro medication. However, I have seen and prescribed medication that has changed lives. People often come to me for the opposite, to get off of their medications, because I'm more of like a holistic integrative psychiatrist. So I have plenty of tools for people as well. But sometimes the answer is a biological solution, like a medication. So that's number one. And another biological solution like that is actually also other things that change your biology, such as transcranial magnetic stimulation. So there's other treatments, sometimes psychedelics for people, other ways to change your biology. Ultimately, other things change your biology too, like exercise and your diet. All of these things change your biology as well. So I advise people in that regard too. So this is biological. Then you look at the psychological. The psychological reasons for why people think those thoughts. They have certain habits of mind. They have certain core beliefs, sometimes wonderful core beliefs and sometimes really limiting core beliefs. So we have to get at the root of their core beliefs and see which ones are no longer serving them, how to shift them, and thereby give them different beliefs which create different thoughts. So that's psychologically. And also people have certain psychological defense mechanisms, often unconscious. Helping people to bring the unconscious into consciousness gives them much more freedom over their thoughts as well. So that's the biological, the psychological. Then is the social. The social is we are not islands. We are social creatures. We need one another. We need a community. We need people in our lives with whom to speak. Often providing people with that, whether as a community, as a therapist, helping them to strengthen the connections they have, whether it be with their spouses, with their significant others, with their siblings, with their parents, will help with their thoughts as well. And finally is spiritual, to realize that we are not here alone. And if people have spiritual beliefs that are compatible with a belief in source, recognizing that you can have help from above with the things that you are trying to change, including your thoughts. And so being able to do your work in the physical world and then surrender the rest to a higher power or to source or whatever you believe is also very powerful. So that's the biological, psychological, social, and spiritual way to change your thoughts.
Fantastic. And there's, I think one of the really positive things that's happening right now is there's less stigma than there used to be around mental health challenges, around, feeling stuck and wanting to talk to people, connect with community. Like you were saying, there still is, a not inconsiderable amount of stigma, but it's less than it used to be. And one of the great things, even within the entrepreneur community, is that there are groups. Conscious Entrepreneur is one of them, but there are groups that really encourage this kind of conversation. There's also a little bit of a shift between some of the investor dynamics, where investors are now showing up in more supportive posture toward the entrepreneurs that they're backing and stuff like that. So I see that happening. It probably hasn't gone as fast or as far as I would like, but I am seeing that happening. Are you also finding that, more broadly speaking, is also the case?
Absolutely. I think that we're in the midst of a mental health crisis, and that affects everybody, including entrepreneurs, investors, et cetera. And I think people recognize that and want to help the people with whom they are working, help them in different ways, not just financially, but really from a social standpoint, from a humanistic standpoint, from a mental health standpoint, saying, I really want to invest in you. And not only that, you're also a human being who might have issues and might have pain. Let me help you with some of that as well. And it's a beautiful thing that is happening.
Yeah, it's a big conversation. It's a beautiful thing, and it's a big conversation. One of the things that I've seen before is, the idea of like, if you really want to do meaningful work and you want to feel fulfilled, if you want to kind of plug the inner emptiness that you were talking about before, is to have a purpose that you're working toward, like something probably outside of yourself. In your work, how do you see people aligning or identifying kind of a bigger purpose and using that to bring fulfillment to their day-to-day work?
Definitely. Like I would say that is people's creative energy. And so exactly that people need to do something with their creative energy, which could be all kinds of things, whether it be a work of art or being an entrepreneur or writing a book or doing something where you are utilizing your energy to create something new, being a songwriter or being a parent or having children. That's very creative as well. That's the ultimate creative act, is creating children, creating a family. But putting your energy in, like decorating a home, interior design, like whatever that is, writing a journal article, doing scientific research, to have something that is bigger than yourself. Because ultimately, therapy is a wonderful thing. But the thing about therapy is they call it cyclotherapy. You keep cycling over and over with the contents of your mind. And that's not necessarily the best thing. Therapy could make you too focused on yourself. And really what we need is to focus outside of ourselves, on something greater than ourselves. That's actually also my definition of spirituality, a connection to something greater than yourself, which could be to source, but it could also be to a set of collective values and to something that enables you to do something that surpasses and transcends just yourself for the benefit of the world. So this is like essential for our being and also for the planet.
And how do we go about identifying that if we don't know it already?
So you mean what your creative drive could be? Yeah. A lot of people come with that. And it's a big question. And sometimes, you have to actually go through a trial and error process. And in situations like that, because I think often people are really afraid to get it wrong. But I think the important thing is to try something, even if you get it wrong, because that gives you data, as opposed to sitting and procrastinating, because that keeps you stuck in fear. And that's stagnation. So you need to have movement, even if the movement is in the wrong direction, but then also have an objective third party with you, a therapist, a friend, someone who's evaluating the whole experience. Is this the right step for you? And how are we going to know if it's the right step? How are we going to measure? What's going to be the measurement that this is right versus wrong and that we need to change course? And at what point do we change course? And then if we change course, what's the next step? And what's the next step? And what truly makes you happy? And why are you just sitting around and getting depressed when you could be doing all this great stuff with your talent and the one life you have to live?
Yeah, no, that's super, super well said. And the encouragement there, as far as I understood it, was, hey, you could sit there and stare at the wall or lay at the couch all day thinking, oh, what's my purpose? I don't know. So I'm just going to sit here and watch Netflix, or go out and try something. And you may find that it's a 6 out of 10 for you, or something else is a 3 out of 10, something else is a 9 out of 10. And that will help you to calibrate where your energy is. And you're using the word creativity or creative a lot. And, to me, the whole journey of entrepreneurship is about creating stuff. Like everyone that I know who's an entrepreneur is incredibly creative in different ways, each in their own way. But we all want to find something bigger that we can plug into.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And I think that's the thing. And entrepreneurs need community more than ever. And that's why there have been such interesting communities that have been popping up all over the world, of entrepreneurs living together, digital nomads living together, people coming together in creativity, and also with certain shared values, whether it be shared values around creativity or shared values around social entrepreneurship or an intentional community, and really interesting people. Like it's almost, this becomes people's families now, and people are looking for this more and more, because I think, as we also know, in addition to a mental health epidemic, we have a loneliness epidemic. People feel alone and lonely more than anything else. And so we need each other, and we need these communities to be able to uplift us and enable us to feel that we're not alone with this. We have other people that are going to be like with us through the whole plight.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one of the things that I think almost all my entrepreneur friends would agree with is that they're all overstretched. We're all stressed out. We're all doing too many things. We're all overcommitted. And, everyone's like up to their eyeballs in task lists and to-dos and all that sort of thing. With that in mind, can you give us coaching on setting boundaries? Can you give us coaching on how to stick with what's important, still be sensitive to others' needs, still have as much empathy as possible, but allow us to make sure that we're keeping our energy to go out there and realize our our dreams. I think of that as boundaries. Tell me if I'm using the wrong
Definitely,
nomenclature,
definitely.
but can you, what do you think about that?
Absolutely. And I think that every no brings you that much closer to a yes, and every no enables you to say yes to other things. And so to really know your values and priorities, stop being a people pleaser, stop trying to say yes to everybody and do everything, even though that, might be what worked in the past. It's probably something that's draining you and keeping you from being able to focus on those most important things. And to realize that there's going to be people who are going to be disappointed, and disappointing others is going to be just part. Sometimes it could be your spouse, your children, etc. But really figuring out the most important things. And the number one most important thing is actually taking care of yourself. If you're not taking care of yourself, if your cup's not full, nothing else matters. You're going to get sick. You're going to get depressed. You're going to burn out. I've seen so much of this on, my doorstep. And we want people feeling good. And then we want them to have whatever it is that they need to thrive, and that what their company needs to thrive, and what enables them to feel aligned with their purpose. So yes to all of that, and all the other things. If you have time, wonderful. But spend more time on taking really good care of yourself.
I always appreciate it when I ask someone for something. Like, even, for example, sometimes I ask people to come up here on the podcast and they say yes, like you. And sometimes they say no, and here's why, because I'm doing this and the other for me. And this is all the things I've got on my plate. And therefore I'm saying no to things that are outside the immediate scope of whatever is important to me at the moment. Okay, fine, cool, fair enough. When I see stuff like that, I think that's a really good example of someone who's setting boundaries. Can you walk us through the mechanics of how to do this and still be polite and feel like we're fulfilling our social obligations?
Yeah, I think that you gave a perfect example. It's to say that, thank you so much. First of all, to acknowledge and be really grateful that such invitations are coming to you. Thank you so much for this. My priorities right now are to take the best care of myself possible. And in line with that, I need to say no to a lot of things that aren't in line with my ultimate values. And so I'm really sorry, but this is not something that I can do. And I wish you all the best.
Simple, easy. We can all copy that. And the consequence if we don't is resentment, because we resent things happening that we said yes to, but maybe we didn't mean. So therefore we resent that. Burnout can happen. One of the misconceptions around burnout is a lot of people think that burnout is kind of like this binary either I'm in it or I'm not. And in my experience, I would say it's much more of like a path. It's like a line, right, that you're kind of declining on. And my question is, like, how do we interrupt that when it's happening? When we notice it, how do we interrupt ourselves and then start to crawl our way back?
Yeah. I mean, for people who've actually been burned out and have had very symptoms of burnout where they have to stop everything, I tell them that burnout and the first symptoms of it are a medical emergency. And so as soon as you recognize it, you have to stop everything. You really cancel everything that week. It doesn't matter what it is. So give yourself the time to go do whatever you need to do to bring yourself back to equilibrium. It doesn't matter. So to really treat it as important of an issue as it is. People commit suicide because they're burned out. That's a reality. So I treat it, as a very high stakes thing, and for some people as a medical emergency.
Yeah, the way that it's been described to me was that burnout really consists of three things. Number one is physical exhaustion, so I'm just totally beat up. Number two is depersonalization or cynicism, meaning I suddenly care a whole lot less about everything that's going on out there. And then from a work perspective, just a reduction in efficacy, meaning I just can't get anything done like I used to. Is that roughly the right one?
Absolutely. Okay. And I think that, the mental consequences, it could be physical exhaustion. You might not be physically exhausted. You might be physically just fine, but you might be mentally completely depressed. And I guess that's the cynicism could be one form of that, but you could be completely depressed and just having suicidal thoughts. That could be a burnout.
So Jim Dethmer, who was the author of the 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership, I saw a post of his where he basically said, there's this misconception around burnout, that burnout is this tactical thing that happens in the professional world. And what he was saying is that burnout is actually it's a spiritual crisis. It's a spiritual crisis of I'm not aligned with what I want to be doing. And therefore my body is rejecting, these things. And therefore all this stuff is happening on the outside, but it really has to do with an inner consciousness, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that that's absolutely right, because it's like a lack of self-care and not prioritizing your well-being high enough. You are not enough, that you don't deserve to be very well taken care of by yourself. And if you don't deserve it from yourself, who's going to take good care of you?
Okay, let's switch back into kind of tactics for folks. So there's a lot less stigma these days about mental health conversations, about people wanting to talk about their own resilience and getting tools to move ahead in their lives. Another thing there's a whole lot less stigma around these days is psychedelics, which are being shown to have all sorts of potentially beneficial applications in this area. How do you think about psychedelics? Where does that conversation start? Where does that conversation end with you?
Yeah. So I think psychedelics are very, very interesting. Not only do they offer a novel biological mechanism to treat some of our most treatment-resistant mental health conditions, they also offer a connection to spirit for many people. And so for people, they can, and what that means is, it could be a spiritual thing, but it could also be just a subjectively transformative experience where people's most difficult to change perspective can change through a psychedelic experience. They could have a mystical experience. They could have their perspective widen. They can speak to, an angel or God or some sort of spiritual being. All of this has happened in psychedelic journeys, but this is all potential. But in addition to that, there's also very real biological mechanisms through which psychedelics, like psilocybin, for instance, helps with depression, with addiction, with a number of other things. Ayahuasca, ketamine help with numerous treatment-resistant depression, things of that nature. So they're very powerful tools. They're used often in sacred ceremonies. And so we in the West are learning how to adapt and adopt these sacred practices to Western medicine. Obviously, not ketamine. Ketamine is a man-made substance, as well as LSD. That's a man-made substance. Those aren't necessarily used as sacred sacraments around the world in indigenous cultures. But many plant medicines are, many psychedelics are. So there's a lot for us to learn from these indigenous traditions as to how to use them in the right way. And then for the things that, ketamine, which is legal throughout the country, people use it for mental health, but there's also people who use it for optimization. And so that's the other thing, that these very powerful medicines could be used to optimize one's brain capacity, or to be able to, for people who already are very high functioning, to take them to the next level. There's many entrepreneurs who have done that. That's not a legal way to use it, and yet it's being done around the country. So it's not something I as a psychiatrist could ever endorse. It's more speaking on what is.
Yeah, and the big shift that's happening is people are no longer seeing psychedelics as like something I'm purely doing on a recreational basis. So it's not like I'm doing this, taking one of these substances and going out and partying or being social or going to a concert or what have you. It's being done in the right place with a certain amount of intentionality behind it to make sure that we're getting whatever result it is that we want, right? But that's the main shift. Is this is no longer a party thing. This is something I'm doing for my own personal benefit.
Exactly.
And so what do you think about the micro dosing elements here? So you mentioned that a little bit. I know that there's a lot of people who will take really small amounts of everything from mushrooms to LSD. I don't even know what else you can microdose, but I know there are people who are out there doing it on a regular basis. What's the effectiveness of microdoses versus a more significant but less often dose?
Yeah. So the idea of a microdose is that it's subsensorium, meaning that you will have some effect and be able to continue within everyday life, but it's not going to lead to the mystical experiences, any sort of hallucinations, or anything that's going to perceptually shift how you see the world. And so there's people who take microdoses, and I have a number of patients who have, obviously, it's not legal. Psilocybin isn't yet legal in New York and Connecticut. There are some states in which it's legal. So I have patients who have gotten microdosing tablets and have microdosed, as well as I've had friends who have done this. And there's many people who are very helped by this. It has an antidepressant effect. It has a creativity boosting effect. It helps people to meditate better, to connect more to source. All of that, so people are finding ways to have a little bit of it on a regular basis if they don't want necessarily to have a full-blown high-dose effect that is hallucinatory and mystical on a regular basis.
And what's the best place for people to start? I mean, I know that's a broad question, but generally speaking, what's recommended as the first step here?
Definitely. I think Michael Pollan's book is excellent. So I would, How to Change Your Mind, I would read his book. And if people want experiences with the different substances, on his website, he has all sorts of places where one can do that legally, etc. And so I would start there. I think that's an excellent place to start.
Well, coming back to what we were talking about before, read the book because he's got a whole survey of lots of different medicines and lots of different ideas, and then see which one calls to you, see which one feels like the right fit.
Exactly.
Cool. I like the way this came back to the spiritual element here, which is, I think really important for people to remember. And what I want to reinforce to everyone who's listening is, we know that being an entrepreneur is hard. There's going to be a lot of ups and downs. There's going to be a lot of things that don't go right. There's going to be a lot of things that challenge you. And if you can do what we've been talking about here today, which is tap into a bigger purpose, if you can find the things that light you up, if you can tap into spirituality inside yourself, and if you can use the tools like the ones that we're talking about right here, that's going to make the journey a whole lot easier. What else would you close with there, Anna?
Absolutely. Yes. And to really listen to yourself and seek help when you need it, and to choose the path of growth, but also make sure that that's coupled with self-care, because if your cup isn't full, you can't help all the other people that you're meant to help in this world with all that you're meant to do.
Fantastic. What a super conversation. Dr. Anna Yusim, thank you so much for joining us today on the Conscious Entrepreneur Podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much, Alex. It was a pleasure.